Ever had a Karen try to steal your property? The gate creaked as Karen HOA's self-proclaimed queen stepped onto my land, slapping a $50,000 fine for controlling the water levels. She mocked me, threatened foreclosure, and thought she could push me around. But what she didn't know was that I had a map, a legal one, proving that she'd been trespassing all along. As I presented my evidence, the gavel slammed, the crowd fell silent, and the truth finally came out. Next week, the battle for my land ends in front of the whole town. The sun was just starting to stretch its golden fingers over the lake, painting everything in a soft, watery light. A thin layer of morning mist hovered over the surface, curling and dissolving with every passing breeze. The world was still too still, almost except for the sound of the occasional plink as my daughter Maria cast her fishing line into the water. She was 14, but her concentration was already sharper than most adults I knew. A quiet presence by the dock, a stark contrast to the storm brewing just a few yards away. The dam wheel, slightly rusted, but solid under my touch, gleamed faintly in the pale light, its surface catching the first rays of the morning sun. I ran a hand over the cold steel of the wheel, the mechanism smooth and familiar. This was my life's work, built with my own hands, brick by brick, steel by steel. It was a promise to my family, to Maria, that this lake would be our sanctuary, our haven in the chaos of the world. But peace doesn't last forever. A car engine shattered the silence. Not one but two vehicles rolled up the gravel driveway, their tires grinding harshly on the stones. The sharp, shrill sound of doors slamming followed, and my stomach tightened. I knew that sound all too well. I straightened, glancing back toward the house. There was no mistaking it, the pristine white SUV and the dark sedan with its official community safety markings. I turned to look at Maria, who had reeled in her fishing line, her eyes now locked onto the approaching cars. "Stay calm, kiddo," I muttered under my breath as I moved toward the dam's wheel. They were here. I heard the unmistakable click of heels on the gravel, and then the sound of a voice that made my blood run cold. "Jack Mercer." Karen Whitman's voice rang out as sharp and cold as the wind that had picked up. She stood at the front of the group, her face a permanent mask of disapproval. "We've issued you a final warning. Your unauthorized manipulation of the community water table must stop immediately." I turned slowly, meeting her eyes, my hand still resting on the wheel. She had brought her sidekick Louise and the ever-present security officer. They were all here to intimidate, to make me submit, to make me pay. "You've got to be kidding." I said, my voice steady, but every muscle in my body screamed with the urge to fight back. "I'm not manipulating any water table. I'm managing my property." Karen's eyes narrowed, the corners of her lips lifting into that familiar venomous smile. "That's not how we see it, Mr. Mercer. You violated Covenant 17B subsection D." She shoved a thick certified envelope into my hand. The gold seal on the front gleamed like a warning. I glanced at it for a moment as if trying to process the weight of it. $50,000. A fine so absurd, so impossible it might as well have been a threat. And that's exactly what it was. "Pay this within 30 days or we'll foreclose." She added, her words dripping with malice. "This lake of yours is a danger to the community. If you refuse to comply, we'll take everything you own." My jaw clenched. I felt the envelope's weight in my hand, but I couldn't let her see my anger. Instead, I stood there, my fingers tightening around the paper, not knowing whether to tear it up or burn it. Maria was still standing on the dock, her back stiff and her gaze darting between me and Karen. I knew she could feel the tension rising, and I could hear her sharp intake of breath like a small animal sensing danger. I looked at her and tried to smile, but it was a brittle, empty thing. "Is it really worth it, Jack?" Karen sneered, her voice carrying across the lake like a jagged stone skipping across water. "You don't stand a chance against the HOA. Don't make me report you to the county, and if you resist, I'll have to call 911. That's when I felt it. The shift inside me, like the sound of gears turning, a quiet fury simmering under my skin. The last part of her words, the veiled threat, broke the dam I'd been holding up. The pressure, the years of torment, the constant bullying from her and the HOA had all rushed to the surface in a wave of cold clarity. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to shout. I just needed to stand my ground. I turned back toward the dam, my hand still gripping the wheel. My fingers brushed against its smooth surface, and I felt the cool metal bite into my skin, grounding me. I didn't care about her threats anymore. I didn't care about the fine or her smug face or the paper she'd shoved into my hands. "We'll see who owns this lake," I whispered under my breath. My words were barely audible, lost in the wind, but I knew they were heard. For the first time in a long time, I was no longer the one being pushed. This time, I was the one who would push back. The diner was slow for a Tuesday morning, just the usual faces nursing their cups of coffee, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead competing with the soft clink of silverware on chipped plates. Bill, my neighbor from a few blocks down, was seated at the counter, his eyes glued to the paper in front of him. I didn't want to believe it, but the moment I walked in, I could feel the eyes on me. "Morning, Jack," Bill said, though his voice was hollow, like he was forcing the words out. "Hey, Bill," I replied, grabbing a coffee from the counter and settling into the seat across from him. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with a forced smile, slid a piece of folded paper across the table. It was the HOA newsletter, printed on cheap paper, stained in places with the usual grease from the grill. The bold headline screamed at me, "Mercer's Dam Puts Families at Risk." My stomach sank. I didn't need to read the article to know what it was about. Karen had wasted no time in spreading her narrative. The community was already turning against me. I could feel the judgment in the air, like an electric charge building up. The waitress didn't say a word, but I could see her eyes dart to the corner of the room where a small bulletin board was pinned with a red flyer, "Emergency HOA Meeting Tonight. 6:00 p.m. All members welcome." I tried to ignore the nagging sense of isolation creeping up my spine, the feeling that the walls were closing in. But there was no time for that. I was on damage control now. No one would listen to my side until I gave them a reason to. I grabbed the newsletter, shoved it into my bag, and walked out, giving Bill a half-hearted nod as I left. I pulled into the post office lot, my mind already working on a plan. I had to contain the smear before it spread. With Karen's 911 incident report making its rounds, the last thing I needed was for anyone to believe her lies. The thing about small towns was they were perfect for spreading rumors. And every rumor told every bit of gossip was one more step toward my isolation. I slid out of the truck and walked into the post office, my eyes scanning the room. It was empty, save for Tom Gable, the local postmaster, who was sorting through a pile of envelopes behind the counter. "Tom," I said, giving him a nod. "Heard the news." Tom barely looked up from his work, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. "Yeah, can't say I'm surprised. Karen's been stirring the pot for a while now. Always has to have something to complain about." I forced a smile. "Good to hear." I grabbed my mail, keeping it short. I needed to get back to the house and start my counterattack. Back home, I sat in my office, the glow of the computer screen lighting up the room. My phone pinged with a new email alert. I clicked it open. Special HOA session, 6 p.m. Another one of Karen's orchestrated events to rally the troops. This wasn't just about a fine anymore. This was about turning the community against me. If I didn't do something fast, I'd be out of this town faster than I could blink. I grabbed my camera from the desk and set it up in the corner of the room. The red light on the lens blinked to life, and I began documenting everything, each email, every little detail, every rumor circulating. I wasn't just going to sit back and let Karen control the narrative. No, this was my fight, and I was going to win it by any legal means necessary. I opened the HOA newsletter again this time, taking a photo of the article. I followed it up with a screenshot of the 911 call record proof that Karen had exaggerated the situation, twisted the truth to make me look dangerous. The emails were flooding in now, some from neighbors, some from other HOA members. They were asking questions, trying to figure out if Karen was right. I didn't respond to them all. I just kept quietly recording. As the evening approached, I found myself back in the workshop, standing before my tool bench. The air smelled like oil and sawdust, the familiar scent of hard work. The red light from the camera washed over the bench, a silent observer. I pinned the newsletter to the wood with a tack, staring at the headline, trying to calm the rush of anger that surged inside me. "Fear doesn't need facts," I muttered to myself, quoting one of the lines from the newsletter, the ones that twisted the truth into something unrecognizable. I needed to remind myself of that. Fear, the one Karen was spreading, was based on nothing but lies. I wouldn't let it control me. I took one last look at the camera, making sure it was still recording. The evidence was all there. I wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. The county office basement smelled of musty paper and dust, the low hum of the overhead lights blending with the steady rhythm of a nearby fan. Rows of boxes sat stacked in tight rows, their labels faded and worn. The kind of place that felt like it hadn't been touched in years, save for the few dedicated souls who kept the old records alive. It was here, in the cool, dim light of the basement, that I would find the answer I needed, or at least the start of one. Jack, the archivist, greeted me, looking up from behind a cluttered desk. His name was Elias, a quiet man who'd worked here for decades. His glasses always slid down his nose, and his fingers were stained with ink from years of handling official documents. "You ready for some history?" I nodded, trying to hide my nervousness. I wasn't sure what I was hoping to find, but I knew I had to find something. The HOA had already gone too far, and now it was my turn to turn the tables. Elias shuffled a few papers before grabbing a large plat map from a shelf nearby. He laid it down on the table with a thud, the edges curling from age. The map looked like something you'd find in an old history book, the kind you dust off at the library, but never quite get the full story from. "You'll find what you need here," Elias said, adjusting his glasses. He pulled out a magnifying glass and began scanning the map. "This one's the official county plat, from back when this whole area was laid out." I leaned in, peering at the small, faded markings on the map. There it was, the section where the HOA was supposed to stop right before the dam. But the HOA had made a move in their own version of the map that had gone unnoticed until now. I pulled out the glossy community drainage easement document the HOA had sent me, the one where they claimed ownership of the land that ran directly up to the dam. It didn't match. I could see it clearly now. The HOA map had shifted the line, giving them more land than they were entitled to. Elias clicked his tongue, his fingers tracing the lines of the county survey. "They've been trespassing since formation," he said quietly, as if to himself, but loud enough for me to hear. I could feel the weight of his words settle over me. It wasn't just a mistake. It was deliberate. They'd been taking land they had no right to for years, and now I had proof. Elias pulled out a few more documents from the drawer, showing me the chain of signatures on the original land grant, confirming the boundaries and the rights that the HOA had over the property. The more we went through, the more the evidence stacked up. The HOA's version of events was a lie, a carefully constructed one. But the records, the real records, told a different story. I felt the first glimmer of hope since Karen Whitman had first walked into my life with that threatening letter. I wasn't alone in this fight anymore. I had something tangible now, something that could back up everything I'd been saying. "I'll need these," I said, pointing to the plat map and the deeds. Elias nodded, making copies and sealing them in a certified envelope for me. He handed me the documents with a quiet smile, a flicker of approval in his eyes. "Records remember what people forget." He said, his voice steady. You've got what you need now. I slipped the envelope into my bag, the weight of it solid in my hands. This wasn't over. But for the first time, I felt like I had the upper hand. I had the proof, and I knew exactly where it would go next. The sun had begun to set as I walked out of the basement, the sealed envelope tucked safely under my arm. The air outside was thick with humidity, the soft buzz of cicadas filling the evening air. I couldn't stop thinking about the look on Karen's face when she found out what I had. This wasn't just a legal fight anymore. It was a battle for respect, and I was ready to win it. I walked to my truck, the documents secured in the passenger seat. The road stretched out before me, dark and quiet. There was no turning back now. I was going to take the fight to the HOA, and this time I wouldn't back down. The storm raged outside, its thunder vibrating through the walls of the house. The hum of the wind was a constant companion, growing louder as the rain began to pound the roof. But inside, there was only silence. An eerie, focused silence that enveloped the room as I stared at the certified letter on my desk. The envelope was crisp sealed and carrying the weight of its content with an almost tangible force. It was the kind of letter you don't open without knowing exactly what's inside yet, that didn't stop me from tearing it open as if my hands had a mind of their own. I read the text quickly, but the words didn't change no matter how many times I reread them. The HOA had sent their final notice. H1207. I had 72 hours to surrender control of my property or face an injunction. My eyes skimmed the letter again, and then I set it down with a steady hand. I had been expecting this. The HOA wasn't going to back off without a fight, but they didn't know who they were dealing with. They had no idea how deep this ran. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, almost mockingly, as I slid the letter aside and pulled out a torque chart and survey overlay. The chart detailed the pressure building from the dam, a clear indication that the HOA's claim of drainage easement was fabricated. The dam cameras blinked a small red dot on the screen reading 0317. It wasn't just a timestamp, it was a countdown. I leaned back in my chair, the storm's hum almost drowned out by the rapid beating of my heart. I knew the next steps. I had to prepare everything. The only way to fight back was to be precise, careful, lawful. I couldn't let this escalate any further. I turned to the phone and dialed Bill's number. The line clicked once before he answered, his voice hoarse from the late hour. "You're going to need to call the county," I said, staring at the clock ticking toward midnight. "Alert them and the fire department. Non-emergency lines only. Tell them everything's in order but ready for a potential issue." Bill grunted on the other end, likely stretching out of his recliner to get a pen. "Understood. I'll have it logged. Should I log timestamps too? Get everything on record. We need to show them that we've been prepared and that they have no legal claim to this land. The truth is on our side, and I'm going to make sure it's documented." I hung up and set the phone aside. My next task was clear legal notices. I had to print them. They had to be precise, listing the facts and clearly stating the violation of property rights by the HOA. I began typing furiously, each word an inch closer to holding my ground in the looming battle. The documents had to be airtight. Every move needed to be legal. Nothing left to chance. I heard Maria's footsteps behind me as she entered the room, her voice tinged with concern as she peered over my shoulder. "Jack," she said softly, "will we lose it?" I looked up at her, the question hanging in the air like the storm outside. The weight of her words hung heavily, but I kept my composure. "Not if I can prove the truth." I replied, my voice steady. "We have the evidence. We have the law on our side. They can't take what is rightfully ours. Not like this." She nodded, her eyes filled with both fear and trust. I could see the uncertainty in her, but she was starting to believe that I had a plan, and that was all I needed right now. The house was still, save for the occasional flicker of the dim light overhead. The wind roared outside, but inside everything was controlled. Everything was prepared. I printed the notices and pinned them to the wall beside the plat map, the same one that had been my guide since the beginning. The notices were clear, concise. There would be no confusion. I glanced back at the clock, 03:15. The red light on the camera blinked steadily like a heartbeat, counting down the seconds until the next move. I set an alarm for 03:17, the moment when the storm would finally break. It wasn't just about holding on anymore. It was about showing the HOA what it meant to stand firm. I moved to the window and looked out at the rain, the steady downpour washing the world clean. I thought about the fight ahead, about Karen Whitman, the HOA, the impending court battle. But most of all, I thought about the weight of the truth, and how it would all come out sooner or later. With one last glance at the notices, I stepped away from the desk, the finality of the moment sinking in. The storm was coming, but so was the fight. The gate creaked open with a sharp metallic groan, its hinges complaining against the weight of time. I didn't hesitate. I stepped through the cold air, biting at my skin, my breath coming out in visible puffs as the rain continued its steady descent from the darkened sky. From the corner of my eye, I saw the flash of headlights in the distance. It wasn't the sheriff, but I knew who it was before I even had to turn. Karen Whitman, her SUV skidding to a halt as if she hadn't expected me to make a move so soon. The neighbors had gathered across the creek, peeking out from behind fences and trees, watching this tense standoff unfold. Bill stood a few steps behind me, silent, his eyes fixed on the water. The cameras were rolling, the red light blinking ominously as it captured every moment. This wasn't just a statement. This was a demonstration. I stepped carefully onto the platform, the sound of water lapping at the edges of the dam as I moved forward. The creek bed below was calm for now, the flow under control. The water had reached a certain point, and with just the right pull of the lever, the controlled outflow began, the steady current flowing and filling the bed, advancing toward the stone wall that had been the source of so much tension between us. It was a moment of undeniable control. The water rose steadily, inching its way to the stone wall, the boundary, the line. And when the water finally reached it, I stopped. It was perfect, the flow, halting exactly at the wall. There was no question now. That wall is the line, I said, calmly turning to face the growing crowd of neighbors, all of them watching, some of them with wide eyes, some with skepticism. But the proof was in front of them, the truth embodied in the flowing water and the stone wall. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the filed plat map, the official county document that confirmed exactly where the HOA's jurisdiction ended. I handed copies to the closest neighbors, watching as they accepted the documents with varying degrees of disbelief. Karen, however, was having none of it. Her face contorted in fury as she stormed toward me, her hands trembling with anger. "You're flooding the creek!" she screamed, her voice shrill, cutting through the sound of the water rushing behind me. I stood my ground, my eyes locking onto hers with steady resolve. "Call them," I said, meeting her frantic gaze. "I'm within my rights." I didn't flinch. I was ready for this moment. Let her call 911. Let her try. The law was on my side. The camera rolled, capturing the exchange in perfect clarity. Karen pulled out her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed. 911. Emergency. He's flooding the creek. He's destroying everything. I turned to the camera, facing it directly. "You can tell them all you want," I said, my voice cutting through the tension. "But the truth is here. I'm within my rights. And this wall," I pointed to the stone boundary behind me. "This wall is the line. It's my property." The water was still now perfectly contained. It stopped at the wall just as it should. The flow was controlled, the power I had demonstrated now irrefutable. I looked at Karen as she held the phone to her ear, her face flushed with anger, but there was a hint of uncertainty in her eyes. She didn't know what to do with this truth. The HOA, all their threats and lies had been laid bare in front of everyone, and I wasn't backing down. Not now. Paper outlives noise. The words were simple, but they carried weight. I said them aloud, knowing full well that the documents in my hands, those maps that permit, were the true authority. They were the things that would outlast Karen's shouting her threats, her calls to 911. The noise would fade, but the paper would remain. The law was clear. My property was mine, and no amount of hysteria would change that. I took a deep breath, glancing over at the still water, the stone wall standing firm against the flow. It was a perfect line, a clear boundary, and that was the moment Karen had just crossed. The scent of stale coffee mixed with the faint buzz of whispered conversations filled the air. The low hum of people shifting in their chairs, the shuffle of feet, the rustle of papers, every sound seemed amplified in the cramped HOA clubhouse. The seats were mostly filled a mix of neighbors, HOA members, and a handful of curious onlookers. The tension was palpable thick in the air as the clock ticked closer to the start of the meeting. I sat at the front, my back, straight hands clasped in front of me. Bill sat beside me, his phone on speaker. The county clerk's voice crackling through the speaker. Louise had already passed me the projector remote, and everything was in place. It was time. I reached for the microphone, the click echoing through the room. The subtle sound seemed louder than it should have been, but in this silence, every noise took on a new significance. I cleared my throat, and the crowd hushed immediately, every eye on me. "Let's put this on record," I said, my voice steady. No hint of the storm I felt brewing inside. Behind me, the projector flickered to life. The first slide, crisp and clear, displayed the original county plat. My finger traced the boundary lines, a simple visual marker, but one that would change everything. Foreshadow Bill's phone buzzed softly beside me. I didn't need to look to know it was the county clerk confirming the details we had already discussed. The truth was on its way, live and unfiltered. I turned the microphone toward the board, to the dozen or so faces that had been so quick to judge, to accuse me of fraud. They sat there, their eyes not quite meeting mine, yet aware of what was coming. The goal was simple: force the HOA to hear the confirmation they'd tried so hard to bury. To hear the truth spoken aloud by the county clerk, confirming that I was right all along. The clock on the wall ticked onward as I moved toward the projector screen, changing the slides with practiced precision. The maps were clear. The boundary lines were unambiguous. The first slide was the county's official plat showing the surveyed boundary of the property clear as day. The second slide, a photo of the HOA's community drainage easement, highlighted how the HOA had illegally extended its claims beyond the proper boundary. As the images flickered across the screen, I heard the murmurs from the crowd. There were a few gasps, a few people leaning forward studying the images as they processed the information. Karen's face was twisted in disbelief, her lips pressed into a thin line. She knew this was the moment she'd been dreading, and yet she was still refusing to believe it. I leaned into the mic again. "These maps," I said, my voice firm, "show the real boundary. This is what the county has recorded." But Karen wasn't having it. Her voice, shrill and dismissive, cut through the room. "That's not possible," she snapped. "This is just—" She floundered, her voice shaking, but still trying to command authority. "You're misinterpreting the maps. This is all a mistake." The sheriff, who had been standing near the back of the room, stepped forward, his boots echoing on the hardwood floor. He was a big man, his presence enough to make Karen flinch. Micro-climax. Karen Whitman. He set his voice deep and controlled step outside. There was no hesitation in his tone, no sign of sympathy. The room went silent. Karen's mouth dropped open in protest, but there was nothing she could say to stop what was happening. The sheriff wasn't giving her a choice. He turned his head toward the other members of the board, the people who had been complicit in her actions, who had remained silent when the boundaries were stretched beyond reason. He didn't need to say more. The evidence was overwhelming. Karen stood a little too fast, knocking her chair back with a loud crash. She wasn't done yet, of course she wasn't, but the damage had already been done. The crowd was watching, and they knew the truth now. The clubhouse was different this time. It was the same place, the same old wood paneling, the same creaky chairs, and the faint smell of coffee lingering in the air. But there was a sense of change now. The old board was gone, replaced with new faces. Bill, the new president, stood at the front, his posture straight, his voice calm and reassuring as he called the meeting to order. The sun filtered through the windows, casting long, warm rays over the room. The atmosphere was quieter than usual, more contemplative, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. In the back row, I saw him. The archivist, my mentor, had come back for this. His presence was quiet, but undeniable. I felt a sense of calm, a reassurance that the journey we had started together was finally reaching its natural conclusion. Foreshadow. The ledger on the table was open, its pages neatly laid out with columns of numbers and names. The refund totals, the credits to the families were listed there. It wasn't just a ledger. It was the tangible evidence of our victory. Beside it, the agenda had been laid out, and the words "boundary resolution" caught my eye. The last piece was falling into place. The new board had called the meeting to resolve this once and for all. Bill's voice broke through my thoughts, reading through the prepared motions. The crowd seemed tense, waiting for the final word. The goal was clear. Take the justice we had fought for and convert it into a community-wide echo. To ensure that this victory wasn't just mine, but one for everyone who had been wronged by the previous regime. This moment would be remembered not as a victory for one man, but as a turning point for the entire community. Bill stood confidently at the front of the room. The first motion was made, and I couldn't help but feel a wave of relief when Bill read it aloud. I propose to void all fines imposed by the previous board and to institute an annual audit to ensure transparency. A murmur of approval rippled through the room. It was small, but it was significant. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about fairness, about setting things right for the entire community. The second motion followed swiftly. Bill proposed an amendment to the bylaws, one that would hold the board accountable every year. The change was simple, but monumental, a shift from the opaque practices that had ruled the HOA for so long to a system of checks and balances that everyone could trust. Plot progression. Bill's proposal passed without issue. The fines that Karen had imposed, the ones that had been weaponized to tear apart families, were erased. The weight that had hung over us all for so long was lifted. The new bylaws passed with unanimous support. The most significant change, however, came when Tom, the former HOA member who had supported Karen, stood up and addressed the room. He cleared his throat, his voice barely above a whisper at first. I just want to say that I was wrong. I supported Karen. I believed in her, but I see now that I was part of something that wasn't right. I apologize, truly. The room went silent. For a moment it felt like the whole world had paused. The weight of his words hung in the air, and I watched as the room processed his apology. Then, slowly, one by one, the neighbors began to clap. At first it was hesitant, unsure, but as the seconds passed, the applause grew louder, stronger. It wasn't just for him. It was for the entire community. It was the first step toward healing. Climax. The silence between the apology and the applause was almost unbearable. It was the kind of silence that feels like it lasts forever, the kind that holds all the weight of years of struggle, all the frustration, all the anger. And then the clap broke through, one slow, deliberate sound followed by another. Then the room erupted. There was no rush, no frenzy. The applause built gradually, almost reverently. It wasn't just a gesture of approval. It was a declaration, a moment of recognition. It was a community taking back its voice, claiming its right to be heard. Bill raised his hand, signaling for the crowd to quiet down. The applause tapered off, and he looked around the room, meeting the eyes of everyone present. "We'll place a plaque at that wall," Bill said, his voice resonating in the stillness. "To remember this day, to remember what we've done here. This is not just about today, it's about the future." His words echoed in the room, and I felt something shift inside me. The fight was over, and we had won not just in the legal sense, but in the moral one. This was the moment where we could finally breathe again. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a soft golden hue over the lake. The sounds of sizzling on the BBQ grill mixed with the fresh evening air, drawing the small crowd into a quiet anticipation. It wasn't just another community gathering. This was different. This was the culmination of everything we had fought for, everything we had sacrificed. Maria stood quietly by the gate, clutching the key. It was more than just a simple object. It was a symbol of everything that had led to this moment, the key to the future, the key to our freedom, the key to this place that now belonged to us, the key that, despite Karen's best efforts, could never be taken away. As Maria gazed out at the water, her fingers lightly traced the edge of the key, a quiet smile tugging at her lips. The crowd gathered by the stone wall, murmurs of excitement rippling through them. The burlap cloth was draped over the plaque, hiding the words that would soon be revealed. It was a subtle reminder of how far we had come from being unjustly targeted by the HOA to standing here now on our own terms. Bill, now the new president of the HOA, stood to the side organizing the final details of the dedication ceremony. His presence felt like the final stamp of approval. Once a critic, now a supporter, Bill had seen firsthand the lengths we had gone to in order to restore justice. The transition was complete, and the community had rallied behind it. As I looked over at him, I could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a small victory. It was a turning point. The sun had nearly dipped below the horizon, and the orange glow reflected off the lake, turning it into a shimmering expanse. The stone wall stood firm in the distance, its place in this story now secured. It had been the focal point of our battle, the physical manifestation of the boundary we had to protect. The wall wasn't just a piece of property. It was a symbol of our rights, our ability to stand up against those who tried to take what was rightfully ours. And now, as the sun set behind it, it felt like the final piece of this puzzle had been set in place. Bill stepped forward, nodding at me to signal that it was time. I glanced over at Maria, who gave me a brief nod. The burlap cloth was lifted from the plaque, revealing the words etched into it. Boundary affirmed by record, not rumor. The crowd fell into a hushed silence, taking in the significance of what was before them. This wasn't just a victory over the HOA. It was a victory for truth. A victory for every person who had been told their voice didn't matter, who had been silenced by the weight of a false narrative. The silence held for a moment, and then, as if on cue, the applause began. It was quiet at first, uncertain, but then it grew, swelling into a full roar as the realization of what had happened settled in. This wasn't just my win. This was all of ours. The applause wasn't for me, but for the community that had come together, for the truth that had been fought for the justice that had finally been served. And then, amidst the clapping, I stepped forward. My voice cut through the noise. It was steady, calm, but firm. Finally, someone fought back. The words hung in the air, and for a moment everything else seemed to fade. The clapping slowed, the noise dimmed, and it was just my words left. It wasn't just a statement. It was the culmination of every battle we had fought. It wasn't just about property rights. It was about respect, about standing up to those who would silence us. It was about making sure the truth was never lost, no matter how loud the lies became. The crowd, momentarily stunned, then erupted into even louder applause. But this time it wasn't for the fight we had won, it was for the future we had secured. This was our legacy. This was the moment we had fought for. The moment we could finally rest knowing that the truth had triumphed. As the applause rang out, I stood still looking at the stone wall. I felt the weight of everything we had accomplished, the weight of the fight that had brought us here. The camera panned over the lake, catching the last of the golden light as it shimmered on the water's surface. This was more than just a view. It was the view of my victory, my property, my home, and no one would ever take that from me again. The crowd continued to cheer, but I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of peace wash over me. I had won, but it was more than that. I had proven something more important, the power of standing up for what's right, the power of truth, the power of community. And in that moment, I knew that this was just the beginning. What had been a battle for property was now a fight for justice, and justice once served would echo far beyond these walls. As the evening air settled over the lake, the community gathered in quiet unity. The plaque, now dedicated to the truth, shimmered under the setting sun, a symbol of our hard-won victory. In this moment, we weren't just securing property rights, but laying the foundation for a future where justice once done would echo across generations. The fight had been long, but it was never just about the land. It was about reclaiming our dignity, standing against those who sought to silence us. In the end, it wasn't loud or flashy, it was steady. Justice isn't loud, it's steady. Share your HOA story below your map might help someone redraw theirs.